He will be there.
When I call on his name,
He will be there.
my God forever the same. Through all the joy, through all the pain, say the word and I'll go where you want me to. Listen to me now.
Hello and welcome to the First 30 Days podcast. I'm Carrie Grant.
And I'm David Grant. And in today's episodes, we're going to be talking about community and church.
We have an amazing guest today. I'm so excited. It's the wonderful Reverend Dr. Graham Adams. Is that right?
Yes.
All those titles? Amazing. Now, Graham is a tutor in mission, world Christianity and religious diversity at Northern College, Luther King Centre, and an author of books, including his latest one entitled, I love this, Holy Anarchy. Welcome.
Thank you.
Wowzer.
Graham, I just want to say I feel smarter just sitting in the same room as you.
You look very smart.
Now, when you think of the word church, what do you think of?
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer that question, but I think particularly it's a community of people who are trying to work out what it means to follow in the ways of Jesus, and particularly sort of focused in that pursuit on what this alternative world that he called the kingdom of God is about.
If that's the case, how does church, as it's perceived by the world and how it's practiced in reality, how did it stray so far away from that definition?
Yeah. Oh, wow. It's a it's a long story, I think, isn't it? But I think there's three things that stand out for me in where it sort of went wrong, and they go back centuries. First, I think there's so much effort was put into the church trying to work out why it was different from others. And so it sort of put a lot of energy into saying we're not that. And in a sense, that's completely understandable. But on the other hand, what that also shows is a sort of twist, a distortion of the gospel, because in a sense, the gospel is about relationship with others, with those who are different. So rather than putting so much business into saying we're not them, it's sort of lost by doing that. It lost a sense of solidarity with those who are othered in the world, those who are different in all sorts of ways. So I think that's one way it went a bit wrong. I think another way is that in that sort of pursuit to try to nail down the details of the faith and so on, it became less at ease with ambiguity and with mystery and with uncertainty, and it tried to sort of pin it down into neat statements and then sort of perpetuated those things and expected people to fit in the box of getting the right statements rather than actually understanding that the mystery of faith, the truth of faith, is a bit more ambiguous and mysterious and uncontainable. And then the third thing is to do with power, I think, so that the church was caught up in the pursuit of power, and whenever it gains power and whenever it sort of lives with power and sort of asserts power and uses power over others, it confuses itself about what the gospel is, and it sort of aligns God with power instead of seeing that in the gospel of Jesus there's something about being with those who are powerless. And so by making that sort of mistake, it distorts something crucial about the gospel, I think.
And when you talk about the church kind of moving towards power, we're going back a long way, aren't we? Could you just give us a potted history of how that happened, what happened?
Yeah, well, way back into the 4th century after Jesus, the 300s, we have the Emperor Constantine becoming a Christian, and then sort of it became legalized to be Christian and it became illegal to be pagan gradually. And so there was this process where the church had been the outsiders, but we're now very much the insiders.
The insiders, yeah.
And so the church took on the whole way of being to do with power. Though I think in a way it's perhaps not entirely fair to put it all at the Constantine's door, because there'd already been this creep towards sort of nailing things down, but was in itself response to persecution. And so when people were scared that they were being persecuted as outsiders, there was an urgency about trying to get it right, and by getting it right, that meant they were nailing it down too concretely.
Isn't that interesting that you use the word persecution? leading to eventually the need to control and then empowerment, because that then comes a bit, a few centuries later, we then have, kind of colonial rule. And has that had an influence on the church?
Yeah, and certainly it has. And so we see in the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries that sort of move of the Western churches to sort of go and tell other people not only about Christianity but about civilization, and with that as well a particular kind of economy. Some missionaries famously talked about the three C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization, and they were one big package. And so they were exporting these things together. And some were critical of how those things were wrapped up together, but others were just went with the flow of imposing this Western way of being onto others. And so, yeah, the gospel has been presented in a way that hasn't sort of examined itself, hasn't sort of checked out whether this is a particular cultural expression. And so then through the 20th century, more and more places saying, hang on, we want our own way of saying this and owning it and in our own terms that isn't imposed on us.
And are people, because I don't feel there's much of that voice rising up. I know that probably in academic circles, liberation theology, came around in the 60s, is that right? So, but most of us still probably experience church, not all, but most of us with what were the three C's that you mentioned?
Christianity, commerce, and civilization.
So there's a kind of, so even if it's civilization, obviously that was applicable with what they believed was the right thing to do with the continent of Africa. But I'm thinking even in our own churches, I'm thinking of living in London, going to church, there is a kind of way of doing it. It's civilized. This is, normal is an ideology, and we've decided what normal is, and that now you're all going to do that thing.
Yeah.
So basically, part of the reason why the church developed the way that it did or the way that it is today, is because in becoming global, as well as telling people about Christ, it was selling a kind of a Europeanized ideal that was nothing to do with the Christian faith.
Yeah, I think in many ways that's right. And because of it going hand in hand with commerce, it was a sort of packaged. It was a package deal. Sort of take this product which we're promoting, and people bought into it because, well, many of them didn't have very much choice. But yeah.
And do you think it's possible for the church, and have you seen any examples of the church sort of returning to its original sort of raison d'etre, its original expression of being based around communities and around the teachings of Jesus without the kind of cultural baggage that it developed and devolved over centuries?
Well, I kind of think that actually there have always been little pockets of that in a range of different traditions. There have always been little pockets of Christianity which has tried to be as flat as possible, with as little hierarchy as possible, where it's tried to be about a community gathering together around the scriptures to discern what it is that God calls us to be. But I think the problem is that you can't sort of say that there's a perfect church, because we're always caught up in things outside of ourselves as well. So there's even where there are some that are sort of alert to those dangers, they're still also caught up in the bigger patterns of how we're expected to be within a particular culture and a particular time.
I'm really taken by the fact that as you speak about churches that are moving towards what you would think that this is how it should be, you're using present tense verbs like discovering, rather than they discovered it like some few hundred years ago, and now we've all got, because it's been discovered, there's nothing more to discover. So we are now going to live like whatever that thing was centuries ago that we all decided was the right way, is the civilized way of doing it. Whereas you're using verbs that we are discovering. We are working together, looking at the scriptures together to work things out. So it's not something that's definite and solid. And maybe for some people that feels very uncertain and threatening even, because they want that, just tell me what to do and I can do it. it's hard for some people to come out of that, isn't it? Right?
Yeah, I think so. That's right. And I wonder whether it's really helpful for the church to remember that it's not the kingdom of God. It puts us in our place, because we're always then pursuing this thing that isn't quite what we are at the moment. So that it overlaps with us. We witness to it, we glimpse it, we pursue it. But it is that dynamic that you talk about. It's sort of like seeking and pursuing and recognizing that what we've got, the institution as we have it right now, is not the goal. It's a staging post on the way.
And so knowing that somehow along the line, various expressions of church have kind of shifted away from the original expression of church, and some may even say the original intention of church. You yourself have become and are a church minister. What was it that made you think, you know what, I want to be engaged in this?
Oh, yeah, really good question. I was brought up in church, so some people step into it from outside, and that is their energy that gives them the commitment to want to throw themselves into it. I sort of grew into it, I guess, but also felt a call towards leadership in some way that in itself, though, has never felt a sort of neat package. It's a growing into it and still growing into it and still trying to work out what it means, and sometimes feeling on the edge of it and sometimes feeling at the center of things, and sometimes recognizing that I'm on the center of things and I want to be on the edge. And it's always a thing that's moving, but it is a sense of owning the fact that for all its faults, I find myself and want to be in this community that is frail and fragile and imperfect, but it still has within it a sort of capacity to witness to this wonderful thing that we're not yet, and that because Jesus helps to shape this community, while other things also help to shape it, that it still has this power and this potential to grow into something different from itself.
Yeah.
But then you are talking about it. You're saying it's fragile and it has the potential to grow, and that doesn't sit with the word arrogance for me. And there is an arrogance sometimes about, no, we have it. We're not fragile. We know what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Why are you questioning it?
Yeah.
So how do we get people? I mean, it's not our job to make people that think they know it to unknow it. But how do you make a change then? How do you make a difference? It's all very well you having, there's a fragility in the church, and we could, how's anyone going to go along with that?
Well, it's not easy, is it? I think, part of the impetus for this, for me, is in things like the parables of the kingdom, and to the stories that Jesus tells about what this alternative realm is like. And so he says it's like yeast mixed in with dough. So and yeast was regarded as unclean and something that you wouldn't normally sort of use, and yet here he is promoting it as the thing that shows us what this new world consists of and has the capacity to be. So I think that's really powerful that he says the kingdom of God is like yeast mixed in with the dough of everyday life. So the church is called to be in that place of being alongside what the world thinks of as unclean, to be in the midst of stuff, not separated, not neat and tidy, but in the midst of it all. And yeast then has the capacity the power to transform things, to bring rising to bread. So that's that shows me that. And there are so many other parables and so many other stories and so many other examples in the ministry of Jesus which show us that he is with those who are untidy. He's with those who are messy. He's with those on the edges. So the church should be that, and it should be in those places, and it should have that humility about itself because it recognizes that it's not that thing yet, but it still has the call to contribute to that process.
That's a great answer.
Really good answer. So it sounds from that answer that you really feel, correct me if I'm wrong here, that the church is at its best when it's identifying with the needs it exists, of the people it exists to serve and reach.
Yeah, there's one writer that I find really helpful who says that where is their hurt, and that's the sort of should be the starting point for the church to kind of like to say that's where we should be. Where is there a cry in the world? Where is there pain? And that's where we're called to be. And in the same way that God hears the cries of the oppressed in the story of Exodus. That we should be attentive. We should be listening to where those voices are, where those cries are coming from, where people can't even articulate what it is that's hurting them.
That sounds, I don't know, that sounds beautiful to me. I'm thinking that church would be a whole lot messier, though. We're going to have some very messy churches if we're going to have that kind of commission on us.
Yeah, and there are messy churches. There are beautifully messy churches. There are churches that do hold together a whole sort of coalition of people who, in other areas of life, would have no right belonging together.
Yeah.
And I think at its best, church can be that, and it does do that in all sorts of pockets amongst mainstream churches and other sorts of churches as well. But there are sometimes there's not as many of that kind as you'd hope, I suppose.
For someone who's not used to church, who may be like watching this, listening to this, they may even have read the first 30 days and thinking, I need to find a church that's right for me. Is that okay? The reason I ask that is because sometimes I talk to people about church and they feel like it's wrong to go to a church almost as though you were going to a restaurant and go, this one isn't right for me, that one's not right for me. I feel at home here. But is that
Shopping.
okay?
You're allowed to go church shopping.
Are you allowed to go church shopping?
Well, so as someone who's sort of can take for granted that I belong to it because I've been grown up with it, it would be really presumptuous of me to tell someone else who's never been into it how they should go about belonging to this thing. So I completely understand that if others are trying to find their way into it, and where some churches are more welcoming than others, it makes complete sense that people should find a place where they feel acceptance and love and the generosity of spirit that you'd hope to find in a church. And if they're not finding it, then it makes sense to move on and seek it somewhere else.
When the pandemic hit, church attendance tended to go online. And all records suggest that church attendance were at a record high for the last 50 years. Now church attendance, that people are back, seems to be slipping.
Yeah, it has.
Why do you think that is?
So there's probably a long story and a short story, I guess.
You can tell either one.
Okay, right.
It's your interview.
Yeah,
Go with the long one.
So there are so many complex processes about secularization, and there are about and why being committed to religious belief, but also committed to religious community, is just less plausible in the world we know. It just does. There's fewer things that help it to make sense and add up. So it's understandable that in that way, it's not something that people rush to do. But then I think you're also asking about people moving away from it as well. So it's not just that there are fewer reasons for people to start going. There's also more reasons for some people to leave because they've been hurt by church, because church has failed to sort of account for the wholeness of who some people are. And so people don't find a space and a place in church, in some churches. There's, again, I think coming back to what I was saying before about church not always dealing very well with the ambiguities and the mysteries of things. Sometimes they want it pinned down. And for some people, as you were saying, some people find that really helpful. Some people find that black and white sort of boxed in sort of thing really helpful, and it gives them security. But others come up against it and actually find at some point it falls apart and it doesn't work. I think some people find the conundrum of God, and how the church sort of tries to, in a way, put God into some nice, neat lines and say, here you are, here's God sorted for you, that actually doesn't ring true for many people's experience of the divine and the mystery. So that, and then there's also issues of power and control, again, that some people, this just doesn't work. So there's all sorts of complex reasons, but particularly, I suppose, I think post-pandemic, it is really interesting whether something happened to community and churches themselves haven't worked that through yet. So I kind of wonder sometimes whether churches were a bit too eager to get back to what they knew and haven't sort of processed the anxiety and the trauma that people have gone through. And so in trying to recreate what they once were doesn't work. They need to sort of become something a bit different.
New shaped people that need a slightly new shaped God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
need to
or at least
grow God.
a new shaped expression of that. Because
It's rediscovering God in a new shape, isn't
Yeah.
it? Because sometimes we have God in pre-pandemic shape and it worked for life, but now we've all been through something.
we're in a post-pandemic
We're in a
world.
different
Yeah.
world now, and it's like, hang on a minute, is that God? No, hang on a minute, that can't be God. So those questions arising, I think, for some people make them want to walk away, and for others, they're just like, well, I'm just going to stick and we'll do it the same as we had it before. And others are in that middle ground of going, no, God must be able to take this and work with me and shape shift around me, or get me to shape shift around Him to work out what life looks like now, and what does community look like now, having all been isolated for so long.
Yeah.
So I think it's a whole number of ways of dealing with that. But I think one of the biggest ways is actually the growth in our minds of how extraordinary God is and how much bigger than he is than we thought he was before the pandemic.
100%.
That's I guess what I'm saying.
And also, at its best, a church can be a place where people find home, find friends, find a family that's not, that they've not had, find a place of encouragement,
Yeah.
a place where they can just be themselves.
Yeah.
Now, in the 30 Days Walking with Jesus book that we've written, on day 29, we talk about gathering community, and we wanted to take a look at that. Would you read it for us, please?
Yeah, sure. The Bible describes Christian communities as the church, which is any gathering or collection of believers anywhere. So this thing we call church isn't a building of bricks and mortar. Instead, it's a building of hearts and minds. The church isn't the structure, it's the people in it. When you come into relationship with Jesus, you become part of his church. We are encouraged to gather, to strengthen one another. Church should be a place where we are able to chew over issues of faith and ask big questions without fear of judgment, where we can meet with others who help connect us more closely to God. This is often called fellowship. Church should be a place where we're able to speak to God and hear God collectively, where we can, if we wish, be loud and expressive, or contemplative and reflective. This is often called worship. Church should be a place to discover together God's purpose for us as individuals and as a collective, a place of envisioning and equipping us to be all God is calling us to be. This is often called mission. And it should be a place to encourage and pray for each other and to walk life miles together. This is often called ministry. It should also be the perfect place to focus on Jesus and to show God's love to one another. And in doing so, we strengthen each other to walk even more closely with Jesus. This is often called discipleship. There are also, surprisingly, health benefits from going to church. A survey of nearly 37,000 people shows that people attending church more regularly are likely to experience less depression. According to the findings of another study, there is a serious correlation between church attendance and better sleep. It seems that when we make gathering in Christian community an integral part of our lives, we not only improve our relationships with God, but are also strengthened, and we improve our relationships with those around us. Can you be a Christian and not go to church? Yes, you can, but in the words of an old proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go with others.
Thank you, Graham. Is it really possible to do church alone? If we are the church.
Yeah. Well, I think the answer again is sort of yes and no. In that yes, simply because some people do, but no, because I suppose to be church, as I think we're sort of saying here, if it's about community, then you can't be a community on your own. And there's something about being in relationship with others that's really important in the gospel, however you form community. There's something about being mutually supportive, as you're saying there in your book, but also there's something about being accountable to one another, I think, because if we're pursuing this alternative vision of the kingdom of God, that if I only have my version of it, I'll only have my biases about what it involves, and
Yes.
I might not unpick some of the things I don't see in myself. So actually, we need each other to help us see things and sort of build up other accounts of things and other stories to help us get out of ourselves and see something bigger.
When you look at different models of church or different church expressions, across the world? I don't know how much you know about this area, but is there anywhere that you've seen that you've gone, these people really have something going on here?
Um, there's lots of different sorts of examples, I think. So even though my church tradition is one that tries to be as flat as possible, it tries to sort of say that the person who's the leader doesn't have disproportionate amount of power, but tries to sort of be a community where everyone is involved in discerning what it is, to work out what Christ's calling of us. So that's my tradition. But even so, I still see things that I admire in more hierarchical traditions too, because some of those actually have been places where there has been sort of a greatest sort of creativity in generating new things. So some of the base communities, as they're called in Latin America, where people, because of a shortage of priests in the Catholic Church in the 60s and 70s, they had to find new ways to sort of be church, but they also generated a way of being church which was about problem solving. What are the struggles we face as a community? And they sort of identified, that we're struggling with poverty here, we're struggling with injustice here. How do we work this through? So they gathered around the scriptures to help them.
And this is where they would have had churches that are like dripping gold with poverty going around in the streets, right?
Yeah, that's right. So within the Catholic structures, you have these then what, in a sense, are quite dissident, quite misbehaving little communities because they dare to challenge the structures that they belong to, and then they were supported by priests as well.
I was going to say, how did the church react to that?
Yeah, well. Diversely. So they were.
I love every single one of Graham's answers is yes and no.
We met. Yes,
the king of nuance.
What was I saying? Yeah.
How the church?
Yes. Some of the priests supported this. They because some of the priests in themselves had also sort of developed these ideas that the gold dripping structures are not what it's meant to be about. So some priests were very much critical of that, and others were very much part of it. And so,
in your book, Holy Anarchy, do you touch on this issue of, the wealth and the power and the prestige of the church contrasted with sometimes the poverty and the needs of the people the church is trying to reach?
So I think I haven't addressed quite that question directly, but there are certainly things that speak to it. Because I recognise and try to address that the church has become part of the structures of empire in the world and has often sort of confused God and emperor almost, and sort of like said, so that the imperial role is God's role, and so that's given a sort of social control feeling to the way the church, and not just feeling, but more than that it behaves like. It throws its weight around, presuming to do to the poor. Whereas the movement of Jesus is a way that's about being with the poor and amongst them, and not just doing to them, but enabling them to be free to generate their own sort of solutions in the face of overbearing systems. And I think that applies to the church too, that the church should be a community where we work through with one another how to address the struggles of the world rather than having them dictated to us. And the kingdom of God is that, like that as well. It's a world where it's not about being controlled or dominated, whether in terms of economy or race or sex or gender, but it's a world where there is flourishing because people are involved, their agency, their own capability is taken seriously and dignified.
Is that what Holy Anarchy looks like?
Yeah, I wanted to ask that. Like, just even the concept of anarchy is kind of, there's no rules if you've got anarchy. So what does it mean? Tell us what that means.
So technically the word anarchy is to do with a realm where there's no domination. So archy, as in arch, is where there's rule over. But so anarchy is a rule where is a realm where there's no sort of archiness. There's no rule over. So there's freedom. But does that mean there's no rules whatsoever? I think it's quite helpful, and one of the themes that work with in the book is to do with childlikeness. And if you think about how children play games, they play games according to rules. And they also play games partly by rules given to them by adults. And so it's kind of like finding new ways to rework the rules of the games that we play. So anarchy it's not about sort of everything out of the window entirely, but it's actually about finding new ways that work for justice and peace and healing, and by giving everyone a voice in producing those things, something new emerges. So it's not fixed. We don't quite know what it looks like yet, and that rings true for the way that Jesus invites us to follow. I think actually that he doesn't have it all put in nice, neat lines for us. He tells us stories. He invites us to follow. He says, "Come and see," but he doesn't give people the exact blueprint. And so it's kind of like we're reworking the rules within the church and in with society. And yeah, that is a bit scary. That is a bit uncertain. It is a bit ambiguous and messy. But it's also, about the way in which love, God's love for us and expressed through Jesus, and which we are invited to have for each other, doesn't try to control where this goes.
It seems the natural follow through of that would be that each church community, if it adopted that outlook, would actually look different to the other church communities. Is that right?
I wouldn't want to say that a church that does Holy Anarchy would be perfect, and compared with the old versions, whatever they are, because it's still something. It's about a community of people that's on the move.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't pretend to have it all sorted. It doesn't claim we're the perfect church now.
I love that.
But it's attentive to asking those questions about itself. It kind of keeps thinking, what is this good news? What does it mean right now? Whose voices are we hearing? Are we listening to those cries of pain? So it doesn't pretend that we're there. But it is a church and a community that, coming back to what you were saying before, Carrie, that is humble enough to sort of recognise that we're not there. It's honest enough to reckon with its own mistakes and failings, and embraces that and says, come and join a community of people who are honest and humble and know that we haven't got it all sorted, but we've still bold enough to know that we're relying on grace and love that is bigger than any one of us, and that captivates us and moves us forward, even though we don't quite know what that is that we're moving forward into, but it's still worth pursuing. It's a horizon that's beautiful, but we're not there yet.
I love that. I love this. I love the idea that people can be, or our churches, which of course are groups of people, can be humble enough to admit fragility, but also brave enough to not deny the imagination. Because when we shut down imagination, then how can we move forward? You can't. You have to be able to think beyond that horizon you're looking at. Well, my imagination is to be able to imagine what would be over there.
Yeah.
And that's often a little bit scary because we can't control the imagination.
Yeah, and one of the things I talk about actually in Holy Anarchy is how the system that we live in often tries to control even our imagination. Yeah, it tries to sort of frame it that these are the only things that are possible. There are no alternatives except for this. And church suffers from that as well. And so about the economy, we're told this is the only way it can be. And so we're told in so many different ways that this is how things have to be because it's just how they are. But actually, God is the God of imagination, the God of an alternative horizon that nurtures those things in us.
This sounds like a beautiful vision of people being able to express themselves both corporately and as individuals within a church setting, within the body of Christ. Looking at traditional church, what do you think needs to change in order for that vision to become a reality?
So I think some of the things that traditional churches are getting better at, they're sort of like staging posts along the way, is that they're often better at things like symbolic actions, so that within the context of worship, so it's not all listening, it's not all hearing, it's not all words, but it actually recognises the role of ritual and symbol to help us enact things that are different. Also, I think there's greater participation, so it's an increase in the range of voices that are heard and stories that are told. I think that's a positive sort of shift.
That's so interesting because I remember doing a radio show, I won't say which one, and I talked about in the church that we run, if someone is doing a talk, then people can interrupt. So we are interrupted constantly when we speak, and sometimes
We were saying, hold on, what do you mean by that?
What do
Can
you
you just
mean?
explain?
Yeah.
And the answer by what do you mean by that may not be answered by me, the preacher. It may be answered by somebody else in the room who may also get added to by somebody else in the room. And so we've kind of left this thing that's happening at the front,
Yeah.
and it's gone sideways and back, and it's now bouncing around the room. But I remember talking about this on a particular radio show, and it then went on social media, that radio show, and people were saying things like, but things should be done decently and in order. Like they couldn't even entertain the idea that someone could interrupt the preacher.
Yeah. The preacher's got to be 6 feet above contradiction.
Yeah.
So we're a long way away from this, right?
Yeah, we are. That's right. And so it's just to refer again to the book briefly before I come back to this, that one of the things that I talk about is how holy anarchy, because anarchy is often associated with the word chaos. So I affirm good things about chaos, actually, that actually some people talk about God working through chaos, because the problem we have is false order. That we're told this is how things are supposed to be, but it's an order that serves vested interests, that serve people who already have privilege and power. That's in society and in church. So if we need a bit of chaos, we need a bit of messing up in order to shift from one thing to another. And so again, this comes back to the theme of childlikeness as well. I think that so if Jesus tells us that to enter into this new world we should become more like children, I think that tells us something about how church should be too. Because often churches are really wary of, but they can be disruptive. Yes, they should be. Children are there in order to be disruptive.
That's such an encouraging version of our children.
It is.
Yeah.
And so, as I know, it's easy for someone to say who kind of sometimes stands at the front and doesn't mind and all these things happening, whereas others get a bit more anxious. But I still think it's something really powerful happening when we allowed that disruption within worship, but also within the life of the church more generally. And it suggests as well that if we're called to be childlike, we are called to be disruptive too, to again go against the flow, to unsettle assumptions, to sort of provoke and probe and ask questions like children ask the perpetual why, because they're never satisfied with the cliched answer.
My favourite sentence is, "We don't normally do this, but..." That's my favourite sentence. I know someone's about to come up with something that's going to be really great.
Yeah.
In the New Testament, the apostle Peter, who was Jesus' disciple, writes about the priesthood of believers. Do you think that meant that there is latitude for other people to stick their hands up and say, look, I have an opinion here, that actually not only is that okay, but it's recommended that people, it's endorsed that people are able to express themselves?
Yeah, I completely do. And I think that applies in the context of worship and also in the context of the church trying to discern what its mission is in the world, that it shouldn't just be one person telling other people what the Bible means, but it should be that we gather around discerning together, encouraging that out of one another, and especially listening to the little voices that don't often get heard.
That's called church.
Yeah.
That's church. Reverend Dr. Graham Adams, thank you so much for chatting to us today. Amazing.
And thank you for being with us today. The first 30 Days of Walking with Jesus is published by SPCK Publishers. It's available online and from good bookshops. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.
The first 30 Days of Walking with Jesus is available in bookstores, online and audiobook. For more information, please visit spckpublishing.co.uk. You have been listening to a Monkey Nut podcast.